All right, guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about the ways to bypass probate. And this is simply through another structure. Instead of just leaving a will, leaving nothing, obviously, or instead of just leaving a will, we do it through what's called a revocable living trust. Now, when I say trust, people typically think of rich people, but there are a lot of different types of trusts out there. And we'll talk about some of them in coming videos, but this one specifically is designed for passing on, for a very simple way of passing on money and assets to your beneficiaries, okay? And it is a very simple and effective way to completely bypass the probate experience, okay? So here are the components of a revocable living trust. Now, revocable means that it can be revoked, okay? This is not a permanent thing. So I might create a living trust, a revocable living trust, and it's called the Dave Lowell, or maybe me and my wife might create it, and it's called the Lowell Family Revocable Living Trust, okay? Whatever the name is, legal name. It's revocable because we can decide at any point to change it or shut it down. So it's not permanent. Once you do it, it's not like that's it, it's done. Those different types of trusts for those irrevocable trusts where you can't do that, but revocable, you can change. So here are the aspects of it. Number one, there's a grantor or a trustor, or also a settlor, that is the person that created the trust and grants the trust assets. The trust is a separate entity, right? Like it's a separate legal entity from yourself. And the grantor owns the trust. Now, there is also a trustee. The trustee is the person listed in there as the legal representative and authority to carry out the directives of the trust. So they have full authority to carry out the trust as it's written. They can't like go changing rules and make up stuff. They have to do as written, but they have the legal authority to do it. They show the trust. They say, hey, that's me. I'm the trustee. I get to do this stuff. Okay. Now, this is a living trust, which means that it can exist while you're still alive. Okay. So while the grantor is still alive. So typically when it's set up that way, the grantor sets up the trust. They list themselves as the trustee as well. So they are the grantor and they're the trustee. So full control over the trust. Then what you do is they put assets in the name of the trust. They transfer ownership from their own name to the name of the trust. So for example, on your house, right? If you own a home, there is a title and somebody's name is on the title, whoever bought it typically. So my name might be on the title of my home, Dave Lowell, it's on there. Great. If I set up a trust, I want the trust to own the asset, not me directly. So I own the trust and the trust owns the assets. So I still own everything, but it's through an entity. I own the trust that owns all these things. So I would go to the title company and I would say, hey, I have a trust. I want the trust to own this. So you complete a little transfer of ownership, a form, and all of a sudden on the title, they put the Lowell Family Living Trust. Done. Easy. So then the trust owns that asset. And you'd go by and do that with other significant assets. Okay. So you do that with investment accounts or properties, or maybe even LLCs that you own. You could transfer them into the name of the trust and the trust owns them. And then you own the trust. Okay. So significant assets, you want to move over there. Now, if, for example, if the trust owns everything, or almost everything major assets, again, investments or homes or whatever, they own the major assets. If you have other things left out, like checking account, for example, or a car or something like that, it's okay to have things that are left out of a trust that have minimal value. Okay. But you want major things within it. Okay. The reason being, you still, when you have a trust-based estate plan, you still use a will. But in this case, it's kind of termed a pour-over will, which basically says, hey, here's my last will and testament. Everything's owned by my trust. And they look and they're like, yep, it's owned by the trust. Like, except everything else, right? My checking account, it's got a couple $1,000s. I've got a car, maybe a motorcycle, whatever. And so you just say, hey, all of that stuff that's left over, the beneficiary is the trust. You move it over there. beneficiary is the trust. Now, as long as that amount that is in the pour over will, that's those kind of remnants that are left over, as long as they're below a certain amount, then you don't need to go through probate at all. Now, every state's different. It can range from $50,000 to $150,000 worth of items in the will. But if you stay under that mark in your state, so you just check your state, if you stay under that value, then you don't have to go through probate at all. The assets, right? So let's say there's a car. Let's say in your state it's $100,000. Anything above $100,000, you got to go through probate. Anything below, you don't. So let's say there's a couple cars, there's a couple $1,000s in a checking account, other random things, and it totals $50,000. Then you don't need to go through probate. The executor of your will just says, okay, yep, those assets now belong to the trust, and done. That's it. Okay, easy. But the major assets need to be in the trust before death. Okay, so you get to bypass probate. That's a major benefit here. Another benefit is it's not public. This is a private entity, the trust. So when you die and pass on, there's no transfer of ownership. The trust already owns everything. So you pass on, and all of a sudden, pretty much nothing happens. The trust just sits there and continues to own your assets. And so there's no process to go through. It's not public. It doesn't go through probate, and it protects you in that way, which is really, really nice. You get to avoid the expense and the time of hiring an attorney and going through the legal proceedings. And you know that whatever's written in your trust is going to happen. Okay. So while you're alive, the grantor, right, of the trust, the one who created it, grants assets in, they transfer ownership. So the trust owns the assets. They are also the trustee. So they are listed in the document as the trustee. They have legal power to do what they want with the assets in the will. So if changes happen, the grantor can go make changes, right? They can see an attorney and say, hey, I want to edit this, and I want to add this provision, and I want to do this other thing. They can do that at any point during their life. Now, what happens when this person dies? Well, in the document, there are listed successor trustees. And so it says, in the case of my will, let's say me and my wife are listed as trustees while we're alive because we created the trust. So Dave and Kirsten Lowell, if any one of them is dead or incapacitated or cannot be serve as trustee anymore, then such and such a person will be appointed the trustee of the trust. If such and such a person cannot fulfill the obligations or, is incapacitated or whatever, then you can list another trustee. Okay, so it's all spelled out in the document. You get to decide who has the power to carry out the directives of the trust. So when you pass away, and let's say if it's a family trust, for example, between two spouses, if one person passed away, it's fine, the other spouse is still alive. Once both spouses pass away, then they look at the document and say, okay, this person's the trustee. Like, are you going to be the trustee? They say yes. Okay, cool. The trustee then carries out the terms of the trust. And it's all spelled out in there. Hey, sell the house, divide it up. Here are the beneficiaries. There's still beneficiaries in here. And you can spell it out in very great detail what you want to happen. And the court's not going to change anything. It's a private entity. It's already spelled out. So what is in the trust is going to happen. And the trustee is a fiduciary, which means they are legally obligated to act in the best interest of the beneficiaries and not break the terms of the trust. Okay, so they are legally obligated to fulfill that responsibility. Sometimes you can have in there commonly a provision where the trustee can actually be compensated for their time for managing the trust and things like that. Okay, so that's a revocable living trust. Okay, those are the main components, but pretty much it's like a will, but it's much stronger. It's private. You skip probate and you can be much more specific. So for example, I've seen a lot of really complicated estate plans working with many, many really, really wealthy people. So if it's simple, it might say, hey, once we're dead, if our children are adults, then go ahead and distribute assets evenly, right? So if we have 4 kids, then each get 25%. Distribute it as you see fit, trustee, right? They leave it up to the trustee. And then when the assets are distributed, then the trust, essentially that entity ends. It's over. It doesn't own any more assets. It just kind of dies and the beneficiaries go on their way. Okay, so that's really simply what happens if it's written out that way. Now, there could be a lot of other ways. Like what if the children are still minors? Minors cannot own assets. Okay, they can't own anything legally. They can't sign documents legally. And so if they're minors, then the assets stay within the trust. Okay, the trust owns that. And so it might say something like, hey, as long as they're minors, the trustee has at their discretion can provide for the beneficiaries as long as they're still minors and can give them money to fund their expenses, right? So in this case, we'll talk about guardianship, right? You would appoint a guardian that would take care of the kids. Well, you can have the trustee distribute money to send to the guardian to take care, for the benefit of the children, the minors. So the trust in that case is probably going to live for a number of years until all the children have grown up and become adults, then distribute assets, then move on. Or it can live for a really long time and say, hey, we're going to give them some money when they hit the age of, so maybe they're minors, support them as they need. Give them whatever they need to live, reasonable expenses and so forth. And then once they're 21, give them a third of their share, but don't give them all of it. Once they hit certain milestones, or maybe once they're, let's say, another age, like 35, give them another third. And then when they're 50, give them another third. You could do that. And you could just drag this out and distribute assets at different times. You could have different requirements. Like, yeah, if they graduate college, then you can give them their share. Okay. Or don't give them their share until they're married or whatever. Like, you can really spell this out in a lot of detail. So I've seen very, very specific ones. And then also in the more complicated plans, you might have other trusts and other entities set up where you say, okay, hey, here's my main trust. We're going to give a quarter of this to the beneficiaries. It's going to go into a separate trust that is governed specifically for them. Then for this portion, we're going to direct this into a charitable trust that enlists the beneficiaries. And this is the purpose there. And then directing it to different entities and different trusts based on your plan. Okay, so we'll talk about why that might be necessary with a lot of assets, but it can be very simple to very complicated. Right now, when you're young and you have assets and kids, simple is great. Okay, you can always amend the trust later and change the terms of the trust as you see fit at a later time. But getting something in place now is important, and it does not have to be complicated. It can be extremely simple. The last thing I'll mention about the living trust is while you are still alive, even though your trust owns the assets, from a tax standpoint, well, okay, let's first, from a legal standpoint, you are still liable for everything that happens. Okay, it's not, being in a trust, you don't receive any type of legal protection in the event of like a lawsuit or something like that. Okay, pretty much wide open. It goes straight back to the grantor. Same with taxes. So the trust is not paying taxes. In a living trust, in a revocable trust, all taxes, right? If there's investments in there and they're kicking off income or whatever, there's gains, all that stuff, then everything flows through to the grantors and onto their personal tax return. Okay. In an irrevocable trust, the trust has their own tax brackets and they pay taxes. They have their own EIN, right? Employer identification number or federal identification number. So they pay their own taxes as an entity if it's irrevocable. But a revocable living trust, everything, all taxes just flow through to the owners. Okay. When the owners die, when the grantors die, then the living trust does become its own legal entity. It's already its own legal entity, but for tax purposes, you get an identification number and file taxes on the trust level, which is separate tax brackets for trusts. All right. That wraps up this conversation. We'll talk more in detail about different aspects as they come up, but that is a really, really good primer for living trusts. All right, guys, see you soon.
Let's keep planning smarter together.